There are few players in the world that strike fear in the hearts of other professionals like Australia's Michael Addamo. Widely regarded as the top MTT player in the world, Addamo is known for a hyper-aggressive style, constantly putting his opponents to the test in difficult spots. Today we'll be reviewing a hand which showcases his trademark relentless aggression, this time against another high-stakes crusher, Michael Zhang. This game comes from day 2 of the 250k buy-in main event of the Super High Roller Bowl in Cyprus. There are 16 players left, with 6 players to be paid, and a cool 3.69 million up top. The blinds are 6,000, 12,000 with a 12,000 big blind ante, and Zhang with 44 big blinds, opens with ace-king off in the cutoff 2.25x, and Addamo with around 29 big blinds defends with queen-9 of hearts. The flop comes trip tens, and Zhang continues with a 22% pot bet. As we can see, the solver is range betting in this spot, splitting between this small sizing and a half pot bet. And the EV regret for both options are very low, so you could either choose one size or randomly mix between both. On this trip board, the pre-flop aggressor has a massive advantage with a greater proportion of 10x, most of the full houses, and the strongest ace highs. As a result, there is a significant separation between the players' equity profiles, which affords Zhang maximum fold leverage. We see that even against this tiny c-bet, the big blind should be folding over 70% of its wide range, which incentivizes all of Zhang's bluffs and protection bets to fire, which in turn provides cover for his value combos. Undeterred, Addamo raises it up 3x and Zhang calls. And we see that despite the fact Zhang has a massive advantage on this board and most of Addamo's range is folding, of Addamo's remaining defending range, nearly half of it defends through a raise. The big blind can do this because despite the cutoff's advantage throughout nearly the entire range, the big blind actually has a greater absolute number of 10x at the very top of the equity distribution. And the class of hands that benefit the most from this raise are Addamo's small full houses, which are raising nearly pure, primarily for protection. So where are the bluffs coming from? Well, given that there are no natural bluffs on this board, most of the bluffs are coming from the stronger double backdoors, including Addamo's queen-9 of hearts. And then the solver's mixing in bluffs with virtually all ace highs, which block Zhang's most likely calling candidate. As we can see, the EV regrets for raising and checking all ace highs are both relatively low, so randomizing between these two actions for all hands in the class is likely fine. And given that the solver was c-betting Zhang's entire range on this board, he should have a number of total whiffs that were just leveraging the cutoff's range advantage. Right, we see that nearly 45% of Zhang's range is king high or worse, so he has plenty of marginal hands that will autofold to a raise. However, ace-king is not one of these hands. In Zhang's shoes, we see that basically all ace highs call, and most combos with at least one backdoor and or one over are floating as well. The turn is the deuce of spades, and Addamo continues with a third pot bet, and Zhang calls again. With the short SPR and Addamo being out of position, we see that this small sizing is the only bet used by the solver, and the big blind's betting range is quite merged. Most quads are betting for value, setting up an easy river shove. The big blind's lower pocket pairs are also continuing to bet for protection, and most ace and king highs are mixing between betting and checking. As for Addamo's weakest hands, we see that flush draws continue to barrel nearly in full, and the rest of these hands, including queen-9, are splitting between betting and checking. It appears that the solver slightly prefers betting with one spade for the flush blocker, or with clubs. This is likely because if Addamo is holding clubs, it increases the probability that Zhang is holding a marginal hand that floated the flop with a backdoor flush draw. Right, when we isolate Zhang's queen x and 9x, we see that most of the floats are of diamonds, spades, or hearts, not of clubs. So when we cycle through Addamo's junk hands by suit, we see that clubs are betting most often and have the lowest EV regret for betting. In Zhang's shoes, we see that against this small bet, virtually all ace highs call again. All flush draws also call, and the solver is floating with a number of other combos as well, particularly with at least one overcard which has a possibility of rivering a strong full house. The river is the jack of clubs, and Addamo shoves the rest of it for around 77% of the pot. When we take a look at the equity graph, we see that the distributions for both players are quite merged, which is reflective of Addamo's small turn bet. Here at the top we have the strongest cluster of hands, which are comprised of 10x combos. With Addamo out of position, we see that around half of his quads check back and half of his quads shove. Note that the quads with the weaker kickers are primarily checking, likely because they unblock Zhang's most likely river bluffing candidates if checked to King X and Queen X. In the next tier down are Addamo's full houses. These hands are splitting between checking and blocking third pot, with the EV regret for both options being relatively low. Ace highs comprise this next group, and these hands are mostly checking. These combos have showdown value, and they also block much of the weaker portion of Zhang's range. Right, if we isolate Addamo's ace highs, which are mostly checking, and his king highs, which are mostly shoving, we see in the unblocker scores that these two groups form very distinct clusters, where the ace highs have low unblocker scores and the king highs have high unblocker scores. And finally, we have Addamo's lowest tier of hands, most of which are betting with an EV regret of just 0.1%. Given that quads make up a relatively large portion of Addamo's river range, in order to balance this polarizing bet, essentially all trash hands are converted into bluffs, including Addamo's Queen Nine of Hearts, regardless of their card removal properties. Zhang goes into a long tank, contemplating out loud the types of hands Addamo would likely have here, and then he finally releases his hand. As we can see, in contrast to the prior node, Addamo's equity distribution is now very polar given his shove, and most of Zhang's range has been transformed into bluff catchers. Basically all quads and full houses are defending, all king highs and below are folding, and ace high is the cutoff point. When we isolate this group, we see that the defense frequencies are a bit all over the place, which makes sense given that this bucket comprises nearly 50% of all of Zhang's hands. So how is a solver determining which of these borderline hands to call and which should be folded? Well, as is often the case on the river, it comes down to card removal. When we isolate Addamo's bluffs, we see that the most prevalent combos are hands which had an overcard and a backdoor flush draw with a 9, 8, 7, 6, 4, or 3 kicker. And we can clearly see with the ranges juxtaposed that these bluffing combos sync up perfectly with Zhang's folding range, where ace 9, ace 8, ace 7, ace 6, ace 4, and ace 3 are mostly folding, skipping over ace 5, which is defending because Addamo only has a few 5x bluff combos. We see that ace king folds some of the time as well, likely because king x is also prevalent in Addamo's bluffing range. And among this group, king of spades is essentially a pure fold because this hand blocks many of Addamo's bluffs that picked up the flush draw on the turn. On the other hand, ace of spades is mostly calling because, as we saw in the previous node, the big blind should not have been bluffing most ace x. So by taking a very aggressive line, Addamo wins a nice pot. And although his play was 100% solver approved, and some may view it as standard, I think that in real life, many others would not have been able to pull these same triggers. Remember, this was a 250k buy-in tournament against some of the best players in the world. They were 10 places out of the money, and Addamo was relatively short-stacked. There were several points in this hand where Addamo could have chosen an alternative, more conservative path. He could have simply called or even folded on the flop instead of raising. He could have slowed down on the turn after his bluff was defended, and he could have given up on the river instead of putting his entire tournament life on the line. Many would have simply passed on one or more of these marginal spots and waited for other, better opportunities down the line. But if everyone is shying away from marginal situations, timid and afraid in the face of uncertainty, it presents an opportunity for someone to stand up to seize the moment. And sometimes, in order to conquer fear, you must become fear.